This is my grandpa, Lloyd R. Hicken. He was born in 1918 and experienced in his youth the challenges of the Great Depression. In his early 20s, the normal sequence of life was disrupted for him and for many of his generation, and in the prime of their life, rather than pursuing their dreams or spending their time how they wished, they were involved with war. Before being drafted, Grandpa enlisted in the Air Force, where he trained to be a pilot, and during the war he flew the B-24 bomber. Until the end of his life, Grandpa never spoke much of what had happened in the war, though he told a few stories. But he spoke highly of his crew and said that they had a great time together in spite of the challenges that they faced. After the war, Grandpa became a medical doctor, where he spent the rest of his life helping and healing people around him. He was a man of compassion and understanding. He passed away at the age of 103 in September of 2021. My grandpa is my hero. I miss him. He is an inspiration to me and to everyone he served. Recently I had an opportunity to feel close to my grandpa. There is an organization that has restored some of the planes that were used back in World War II, and they came to our area offering tours of the planes and commemorative flights. My wife encouraged me to take one of the flights. It gave me a chance to see from the inside what it was like for those who were involved with the war, who were flying those planes, who were fighting for our freedom. The seating was very limited on this flight, and while a few got to ride up front with the pilot where my grandpa would have been, I was given a seat behind the left wing at the side gunner position. We entered the plane through a hatch in the bottom and took our seats up inside. I couldn't help but wonder what it would have felt like during the war to be climbing into the plane, going on a mission, and not knowing if you were going to make it back. From my seat, I had an excellent view out the window, much better than any view on a commercial flight. You know, there couldn't have been a better day for a flight like this. The skies were gorgeous. It was a beautiful, warm morning in June of 2022. As we prepared for takeoff, I remembered some conversations I had with my grandpa about flight. I've been on numerous flights, and my favorite part of any flight is always the takeoff and the landing, but more particularly the takeoff. My favorite is that moment when the pilot hits the throttle and that plane lurches forward with enormous momentum. I remember talking with my grandpa about how much I loved that feeling and asked him what it was like. He said, "It's powerful." I think he really loved that feeling. I had butterflies on my stomach as we turned onto the runway where we would be taking off. Grandpa once told me about some of the dangers they faced in taking off. When a bomber plane had a full payload, they had to get up quick, and they couldn't allow their tail to hit the runway. If they did, they were goners. Every time they got in these planes, there was so much danger, even from the takeoff. That was just the beginning of the danger that they would face on any given mission. They were brave men committed to doing their duty and serving their country. As the plane lifted off the ground in takeoff, chills ran over my whole body, and I could see Grandpa in the front of that pilot seat, taking us into the sky. I suffer from what I refer to as bird envy. There's so many times I'm watching birds in flight and I just think, I wish I were you. I would love to fly. And there is something truly amazing and magical about leaving that connection of Earth and being free in the sky. So for me, part of this was just a pleasure flight. I enjoyed it so much. And yet, being in that plane, I also felt a certain tension. The tension I imagined that these crews in these planes would feel every time they flew. That wondering of what is going to happen today as we go and fulfill this mission in very potentially dangerous places. Sometimes those flights would last for hours and hours and hours. Grandpa was positioned over the Pacific, and while I had a nice scenic view, many of the times they were flying, it was just wide open ocean and cloudy sky. Not much for scenery. Not that clouds can't be all that beautiful, but he also talked of times where that's all they could see because they flew through clouds for hours and hours on end. Our flight lasted for a little less than a half an hour, and during that time, each of us who were in the back of the plane had the opportunity to crawl to the tail where the tail gunner would sit. It was literally a crawl through the tail of the plane as we went towards the back, one at a time. And there was a stool where you could sit on, and where they would, of course, fire the machine guns from. It was kind of a tight squeeze to get back there, but the view, once I got to the tail, was absolutely incredible. Once again, from that seat position on the tail of the plane, I thought about the purpose of even being there, and the sobering reality that from that position, it would have been my responsibility to fire at other planes that were trying to take us down. I can only imagine the intensity of those moments, shooting a machine gun off the back and being able to clearly see attackers all around. In my last moments in the tail of that plane, I wondered if Grandpa had ever crawled all the way to the back as a pilot. I imagined that they could have a little bit of movement, but I never heard whether or not he did. An LED light flashed in front of me indicating that my time was up, so I made my way back through the tail into the main part of the plane where I sat. At one point I examined the plane walls and structure. Of course, a plane has to be lightweight. It's metal, but it's gotta be light to be able to fly. Most of it's made out of aluminum, and really the walls are not that thick. As I sat in that machine gun position from the side, thinking about the high caliber bullets that might be flying, I could see that those walls would offer very little protection, and I felt quite vulnerable. The pilot banked hard left, and my stomach sank, and the blood drained out of my head. It was a rush. You know, in some ways, flight is way better than any roller coaster ride. As we continued our flight and I watched the huge engine pushing us along, I remembered a story that my grandpa did often tell about a time that they ran out of gas. This was a common problem as they flew over the Pacific with really long stretches in the air. Sometimes they were in great danger of just dropping out of the sky. One day they were flying along and noticed their gauges getting lower and lower. They hit absolute empty. I'm sure the whole crew expected at any moment to just drop out of the sky into the ocean, but on they went for hours and hours. When they finally landed, as they were approaching the runway, The engine stopped altogether and they glided in and made their landing safely. I'll never forget the way Grandpa would describe the moment they examined their gas tanks and found them bone dry. He said it was a miracle. Grandpa was a man of faith. He believed in God and believed that God could help and protect him. He had a running list by the end of his life of the times that he should have died but didn't, and he was preserved to the old age of 103. A part of the legacy he left us was his faith. He passed that on to my father, and my father passed it on to me. I believe in a God. I believe he has a plan for every one of us that live on this earth. And while we don't understand the way that always works, I also believe that we're not seeing the whole picture. The reality is, many of those in his generation did not come home safely. They lost their lives. I reverence the sacrifice that they made in serving our country and preserving freedom. And at the same time, I'm full of gratitude that my grandpa's life was preserved, because that gave me the chance to exist. As the plane descended, I didn't want the flight to come to an end. I felt connected with my grandpa in the sky, and I miss him. But it was time to go back to Earth, back to life, back to work. But I hold in my heart a desire to be like my grandpa, to be like the brave men of his generation, to do whatever I can to live a good life, to be a good person, and to just help where I can. Touchdown. That was a really good flight. Hey, I just came off this flight. It was absolutely unforgettable. So amazing to be in one of these machines, to honor the men who spent countless hours, thousands of miles flying to protect our freedom. It's awesome. Thinking of my grandpa today.